I first got interested in the subject of Russia, at least, through my mother, who took me to see the Cossacks perform at the Dublin Horse Show in 1978. And they were like a troupe of sort of dashing horsemen performing, tricks in exotic costumes, so I was quite taken by them. And they also, of course, they came from the USSR, the Soviet Union at the time. The Cold War was still very much in effect, so they were like this kind of alien entity in our world. And I also then, of course, when I was a kid, I was very into collecting toy soldiers and reading war comics, which were big at the time. And most of those comics featured stories about clean-cut British and American heroes fighting the Germans in World War II or the Japanese. But one of my favourites was a story called Johnny Red, a story about a rather disreputable-looking English fighter pilot who ended up fighting with the Russians on the Eastern Front in World War II. So I found that whole kind of environment particularly fascinating. There was something about that drew me in, and I suppose it was a bit of a kind of a forbidden pleasure or interest too, because it was very unusual to have a story in which the Russians were portrayed in a favourable light because we were in the Cold War. So it was really interesting to me that only 40 years previously the Russians had been our allies fighting the Nazis, and now they were sort of on the other side of this divide. So in a kind of very naive way, I suppose, I was interested in the Russians. I was sort of attracted to something about them, even though everything about our culture was very pro-American. As kids, everything we looked to was American culture, American TV, American cars, clothes, and so on. But there was something about the Russians that I was interested in. And I can even remember standing up in class to defend the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan on rather dubious grounds at the time. Our teacher had proposed it as a subject for discussion just shortly after it had taken place in late 79, early 1980, and I stood up to rather precociously explain that it wasn't really their fault. It was it wasn't their fault that they'd always been oppressed throughout their history and they were making some kind of mistake, but not to blame the Russians. So I was promptly told to be quiet and to sit back down and to sort of assume the party line. But so I always had this thing about Russia, and I suppose then I kind of forgot about Russia for years after the Soviet Union collapsed, and I sort of just assumed, like everyone else, that it was now a democratic, liberal country, more or less the same as us. And it was only years later when I started to read about Chechnya and find out about recent history and what happened to Russia after the end of the Soviet Union that I started to learn a little bit more and find out what was really going on.
For a moment in the late 1990s, the Chechens had won their independence. The Russians had withdrawn, leaving a country in chaos.
The MVD.
But 3 years later, the then Premier Vladimir Putin sent Russian forces back into Chechnya following a series of bombings.
The NKVD.
They saw a danger that their role in society could be severely reduced. So they began to look for a way to break the new young Russian democracy's teeth.
The KGB.
They found a little republic that had always resisted occupation, had always fought for its independence.
Now the FSB.
And they understood that if they started a war with it, it would go on for many years, and society would get tired of the war and would want a strong pair of hands and would turn away from democracy.